Exploitable Dynasty startup ADPs and what it tells us about redraft. That's what we're going to talk about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find my newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his fantastic work over at RotoViz. And Shawn, we're going to dig into some Dynasty stuff. We're trying to figure out a good topic for this week. We've been doing a lot of different stuff. Not long ago, we went through each of the divisions and talked about a lot of team-related stuff. We've done a lot of drafting recently. And Dynasty is a fun one, obviously, to always talk about. I always like to mention that I'm not like as into Dynasty, into the weeds as you, and yet still one that I really enjoy discussing, especially when we bring it back to redraft, like we're going to think through today, because there's a lot of these situations you can find some inequities between the Dynasty market and the redraft market, where Dynasty drafters are maybe concerned about a player who is still young, and yet in redraft it's like you're predicting a breakout. That always sparks that's always odd, or vice versa. It's one of those things where you would expect younger players to go higher in Dynasty and older players to go lower, and yet you don't always find that, and so there's maybe some imbalance at times. Always good around this time of year to be checking in both for your Dynasty leagues, and we obviously have a lot of listeners who play in Dynasty, and we'll be interested to hear our thoughts on the Dynasty values and which are fragile. I mean, it's always a fun conversation from that perspective. Which are the most fragile profiles? We're thinking about things probabilistically. We're thinking about things from a range of outcomes perspective. Who has undue risk for having a floor season that's not really baked into their price? Who has opportunities to have a real ceiling and break the Dynasty ADP and shoot up the boards and look like a huge buy from this offseason come next year? And so there's all these ways to think through how Dynasty relates back to redraft. And really, I mean, I think the simplest one is, we've talked about it over the years, that Dynasty should be thought of more as a year-to-year game, and how value can change. And you should be thinking about Dynasty on a shorter timeline. The idea of Dynasty is, I can draft a player and keep him for a decade. But really, it's more about, each year, how is the value changing? And because peaks in the NFL are so short-lived, ultimately, you can't really plan 3, 4, 5 years ahead. It's more a year-to-year thing. And so if you're thinking about Dynasty that way, it actually isn't all that different than redraft on some levels. So a fun concept to bring back to our redraft audience, who's obviously a lot larger than the Dynasty audience, but also important to talk through the Dynasty lens as well. I mean, there's a lot of fun conversation topics to have there also. So anyway, how are you doing?
Good. I had a chance to go on with Eric Balkman on his sort of couple hour, it's a Thursday night show, but they had one Monday this week. And then I was on it. They did a lot of Dynasty stuff. FFPC has fantastic formats, including the RV Triflex format. We encourage you to get over there. Colin and I are actually doing a RV OT listener league startup soon. That'll be a lot of fun. If you've missed out on that, certainly get in. All of these leagues are a blast, and they now have the Empire format as well, which saves a certain portion of the pot back for the first, I believe, back-to-back champion. And so in that case, once that happens, the money's paid out, the league is disbanded, and you get back into more Dynasty format. So if you like the Empire structure, you can also play that one now. I like having the flexibility to do regular format, do Superflex, do their normal FFPC, do the RV Triflex, and now to do the Empire. Ben, we're going to talk about Superflex today, as we love Superflex in Dynasty. We have been playing Superflex on Underdog. Certainly, we have been playing Superflex on FFPC. I've done some shows with Colin on that as well. That happens to be my favorite format in the fantasy football universe. Quarterbacks early are the way that people approach it. I think it is a little bit controversial. I've written several pieces explaining why, especially in FFPC, you don't have to go with quarterbacks to start your draft. And if you get one of these early picks, you can really set yourself up for the next decade by trading down. Certainly we can see why people would want to trade up and would basically, pay the farm to do that when the top 4 names, not surprisingly, are Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, CJ Stroud, and Jalen Hurts.
But what's immediately interesting there for me, and I went to look it up as I was talking through the different age, considerations and things. Jalen Hurts is 25. He turns 26 in August before the season starts. But I mean, quarterbacks can play at a high level into their 30s, and he goes higher in redraft than QB4, right? He goes QB2. He falls behind both Mahomes, who's older than him, and CJ Stroud, who's obviously younger than him. And I think his price at QB3 in Dynasty is really interesting. Mahomes is already 28. There is probably some question about whether the mobile quarterbacks will age as well as pocket passers. Some of the QBs can produce until they're 40. We haven't had as many mobile quarterbacks as we've started to get throughout the NFL's history. And we don't have a great sample of mobile quarterbacks who have aged particularly well, but there are some. Like Randall Cunningham had an incredible year late in his career. In 1998, he was the quarterback of that 15-1 Vikings team when Randy Moss was a rookie. And that was, well into his 30s, if I'm not mistaken. He was a star for the Eagles in the late 80s. I'm going to look that up, actually. Yeah, he was 34. So he wasn't. Oh, no, sorry. I looked up Randall McDaniel, who also played for the Vikings and offensive lineman. In 98, he was 35. So Randall Cunningham was 35, was a Pro Bowl quarterback. He was the MVP runner-up that season.
And for context, how many rushing yards was he adding to these seasons?
That's a great point. And that was really the only year. He actually only ran for 138 yards that year, or 132. So he was a mobile quarterback who so he had a 900-plus rushing, season in 1990. Multiple other 500 plus, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 straight 500 plus rushing seasons through his prime and through his 20s while he was with the Eagles. And then late in his career has that passing season with the Vikings where he's not really much of a runner. Probably similar, I would guess, with Steve Young, with some of those other mobile QBs. But my point was we don't have a huge sample. So maybe the market is saying that Jalen Hurts can't run for 15 TDs and is going to be a different type of player into his 30s. But it is interesting, I think, that he's still so young and going a little bit lower in Dynasty than he is in redraft. And then on the flip side, the Stroud thing, a lot of people have been attacking Stroud's price so far, Shawn, in redraft, where without the mobility, you have to have really, truly elite passing numbers to pay off his type of a price. He's going in, the 5th round, sometimes into the 6th round on most sites in single QB formats. Here, he's the QB3. But that in Dynasty is a really strong argument in favor of his floor, in favor of buying the rookie season positive notes, and that he truly is going to put up Mahomesian drop back passing numbers. That my immediate read on that is that makes me feel a lot more comfortable about his redraft ADP. I've gone back and forth, and I know you're really into Stroud and redraft. I'll admit I've been I want to be very in. I've taken the receivers a ton. I think the Houston Texans offense is going to be fantastic. When we were talking through team level stuff, I talked about them as one of my favorite bets for the Super Bowl long shot. I think they're probably the second best favorite out of the AFC, and they're not priced that way because of how the rookie QB window can help. And they were able to add Diggs and add multiple defensive free agents, and the moves that they've been able to make can help them elevate to the top of the conference quickly in a way that I don't think the market understands or is valuing yet. And yet I've had some questions about whether Stroud, because of the lack of mobility, is going to be able to pay off that ADP. It's interesting to see the Dynasty ADP at QB3. There's a lot of faith there that he's going to be a high-level passing producer for a long time.
And it's encouraging that the team has gone out and added that third receiver and really added a superstar. One of the things that is interesting, one of the things that I have argued, and my most recent article for RotoViz is about, is this idea of Diggs as even a much higher level player in all likelihood than Nico Collins and Tank Dell, despite the fact that their results last year were fantastic. And so we don't necessarily know what order those receivers are going to score in, but as you mentioned, we like them. Even if we don't suspect that Diggs will be there for the long term, the fact that Houston went out and felt it was valuable to the team to create that style of passing attack, that to me is a very strong signal in terms of how they're going to approach winning games over the next decade. I have CJ Stroud ranked number 1. I think that he should be the top quarterback in Dynasty, and I love his redraft price. It was interesting. You mentioned 5th round. Right now, I think he's going like very beginning of the 6th in Underdog. It was kind of crazy because he lasted to the 909 in the MFL 10 of death, which, I mean, that meant that I had to pass on him in round 9, and that was brutal. But I did take Raheem Mostert as my first running back there. Ben, it's interesting when we talk about
Did you already have a QB?
No, I was able to come back in the wraparound there and get Jordan Love at the 10-11 and Caleb Williams at the 11-02. I wanted 2 QBs in the window. That's been very dominant in this format. And I felt like there was a tier break after Caleb Williams. So I was very fortunate. A lot of things in this MFL 10 of death draft have really, I mean, I've just been very lucky in that the tier breaks have benefited me more or less all throughout the draft. So when you get lucky, hopefully you execute and you take advantage, because it doesn't always happen that way.
I imagine Jaden Daniels was off the board when you got back to that range.
He was also available at that round 9 pick. He did go ahead of Stroud. And part of that, again, I think is for the reasons you mentioned, because there is this hybrid scoring dynamic. You know, I may just be ahead of what is reasonable here, but I'm a big believer, especially in Dynasty, but in all formats, that you want to attack the crazy talents. What we saw from CJ Stroud was so impressive that even though he hasn't obviously done what Patrick Mahomes has done, when you surround him with that talent, I think one of the things that you look at with Drew Brees, Aaron Rodgers, Tom Brady, Peyton Manning, those guys scored at some pretty crazy levels for fantasy. We don't know if they would have been able to do that in today's offensive environment with what defenses are currently doing. And yet, because of the passing volume and because of the efficiency in the right year, and I mean, just look at Patrick Mahomes, right? The massive difference between 2022 and 2023. As that passing QB, you've got to be extremely efficient, and you need the volume to stay there. His fantasy points over expectation in 2022, very impressive. He underperformed last year, which for Patrick Mahomes, it's one of the reasons why people were bashing him, right? They're like, oh, you can't do it here. And then he goes and wins the Super Bowl. You're like, oh, right. He is the best quarterback in the NFL. It's pretty straightforward. And we're comfortable with his price in part because you know you're going to get some of those seasons. I think we're pretty clearly going to get some of those seasons from CJ Stroud as well. And then this goes back to that kind of controversial piece at the heart of Superflex in Dynasty, where you mentioned the year-to-year element of it. And we always have this tension between the now and trying to build a team that will retain value over the next decade. Certainly one of the reasons that people like quarterbacks in a Superflex format is not just because they score a lot of points and there is a scarcity there that doesn't exist in the 1QB version of it, but also because these stars tend to really last. The issue for me is that when you mentioned some of the hybrid quarterbacks of the olden days, we also have some information. And when I've written about this and trying to approach it from, a point of complete humility, in that we have a very small sample, you have flukiness that is going to come into play with that. You're going to have injuries that are not in any way predictive of other injuries that might happen to players. But the situation for a Cam Newton and for a Michael Vick, I think it's easy to look back on them. Certainly look back on Cam Newton, who was just not a very good passer, and fail to give them credit for how transformational they were. If players who completely changed the game and were something that the game really hadn't seen before, if they were not able to do much into their 30s, you have 31, 32, you have this situation right now with Russell Wilson, where one of the reasons that trade from Seattle was so controversial was that he was so good, right? It's easy to now be like, we're debating like if he can actually be a starter or not. And whenever I say, I don't think he can even start, people push back like he was fine last year. It's interesting that the conversation is so far removed from what he was very recently, which was again this absolute superstar. And so my concern would be that the legs element of the quarterback play, this hybrid dynamic, that is going to age more similarly to a running back or a wide receiver. It's not that it's going to disappear, but as you get into the late 20s, early 30s, it becomes more difficult, and you have to be able to transition into the passing element more. One of the things that we've seen with a Lamar Jackson is that he will go through these stretches where the accuracy is very poor. The overall numbers and the overall dynamism are still excellent because of the threat of the run and because of the threat of the vertical pass. So I'm not in any way, shape, or form saying that Lamar Jackson is not good. He's an MVP caliber player. And yet,
and it's always going to be relative to the player. And for Lamar Jackson, I think we probably agree as a rusher, I think he's maybe I don't want to speak for you on this. I think he's the best running quarterback in the history of the NFL. I think that's actually like not really like, it's kind of a joke sometimes. Not debatable, but like when you watch him run, and I've made this point before, if like it was always kind of unfair that people were saying, well, through the combine, well, what if he plays running back? And it was a big joke that, he couldn't even play quarterback. Teams want him to work out at receiver, all that kind of stuff. I do think if Lamar Jackson couldn't throw, which he clearly can, he's won 2 MVPs, he could be an NFL running back because he's that agile and he's that fast and he's everything that you would need to as a ball carrier. Whereas other dynamic quarterback rushers are typically like, they're good runners as quarterbacks. Josh Allen's a bulldozer.
Well,
a quarterback.
Cam Newton, right? Cam Newton was an unstoppable force around the goal line, which matters. Michael Vick was almost the Barry Sanders of quarterbacks, where he could pull off runs that left you like
and Fields is like
if
that.
The laws of physics had been broken.
Sure.
Lamar Jackson is
like
the guy who, and Justin Fields gets a few of those, and it's one of the reasons why Fields in a real game, as opposed to practice, is a pretty dynamic player. Lamar Jackson is different just because it's every play, and he's able to. He's this speed runner who's also a downhill runner from a QB perspective. One of the things that always kind of blows my mind is that, you go and look at him in college and Saquon Barkley in college. There's no comparison in terms of which one was a better runner. And Saquon Barkley has been long considered one of the best running backs in the NFL.
So as you were making that point about the rushing, and not to derail us too much, but you're talking about how it will age. And I was thinking through Lamar and Josh Allen. You started to pivot there, and that's why I kind of chimed in. But I was looking up their ages. Lamar is 27 right now. Will turn 28 in January. And at his level of rushing, for me, it's not a major concern in the next few years. I think he's going to continue to produce a lot of rushing value. Josh Allen's already 28 and not the same level of runner as Lamar, but also not really as reliant on things. Like part of Josh Allen's rushing efficiency or production comes from just being a really large human. And it's almost like, you think about like how Ben Roethlisberger was able to play that into sack avoidance throughout his 30s, even though he could barely move. He's still a big, hard guy to tackle. And in his sack avoidance, like stayed around even when he couldn't.
And Josh Allen will remain a starter because he can pass, unlike Cam Newton. But when his rushing portion of
that's what I was going to ask.
Scoring
when do you think that happens?
Deteriorates. Well, I think it's going to be, and for every player, it's going to be determined by how many injuries they've suffered along the way as well. Okay. But once you get to 28, you're in that same danger zone that a running back would be in. And it's not that it's going to be that point where you fall off the cliff. One of the things that Colin brought up to me recently that boggles my mind and doesn't really seem possible, especially when you consider that Raheem Mostert is 32. Todd Gurley is 29.
That's crazy.
When it goes, it goes. And then, unfortunately for NFL players, you don't have that element that you can rely on. But when you get into that 32 range, I think it starts to be very problematic. And that's more the area where a Cam Newton, a Michael Vick, you maybe still get that year. You have a one-off where you go out there and explode. But the likelihood that you can perform from 32 to 40, which is something that we actually kind of expect a Patrick Mahomes to be able to do. When you're looking at a CJ Stroud, when you're already thinking forward to a Caleb Williams, if he, not even if he hits to the level of a Mahomes or a Stroud, but if he's a very viable starter, we're already thinking of like a Jordan Love, for example. Even some of these guys, like certainly a Joe Burrow, if he could ever stay healthy. Ben, every time I pull up Joe Burrow's beginning to 2023, I'm like, it boggles my mind that this coaching staff has been able to send coaches out to other teams as opposed to getting fired themselves. But you have these pass-oriented quarterbacks who could age in the way that Peyton Manning, Drew Brees, Tom Brady have done. And if you get that, and you get those occasional seasons where they hit on the efficiency, right? Because it's going to be the very top guys who also age the best. And so when you talk about a Patrick Mahomes, you talk about a CJ Stroud, you get the extra years, plus you get whichever years that they actually do hit on the big touchdown numbers, for example. I think when you put that together, you've got to give them a lot of respect at the top of the dynasty board, or you have to say that we're subtly overvaluing the quarterbacks as a group.
Well, and my question with the Allen stuff, and I'm looking at Newton's numbers now, and that's been the big comparison for Josh Allen throughout his career. And you're right, for Newton, it really did fall off. I mean, his last good, not great rushing season was age, or I mean, more like great. Sorry, was age 28. Age 29, he comes back a little bit worse, and then he has, as it wasn't his last year, because he has the 1 year with the Patriots where he runs for 12 touchdowns. At age 31, but in between there has some injuries, and it does really start to fade. Like the consistent rushing production for him was in the earlier 20s into the later 20s, and then doesn't really extend into the 30s. He doesn't really play a lot at that point because the passing doesn't really carry when he can't run as effectively and isn't providing as much. The year that he ran for 12 touchdowns for the Patriots, he only threw 8 TDs, 8 TDs against 10 interceptions, and he's no longer adding enough value as a passer to justify, even as he was a great red zone weapon for them and ran for all those touchdowns, he wasn't justifying being a starter anymore. He doesn't, he only starts a handful of games for Carolina. He goes back to Carolina the next year, starts a handful of games for them, and that's the rest of his career. He doesn't start more than, 5 more games after that New England season. And yet, thinking through Allen. So the big question for me is Allen's at QB1. You talked about having Stroud at QB1. And then as we also think about this mobility thing as it relates to some of the younger quarterbacks, I go back to the end of the first round in this current startup ADP, and we're looking at the RotoViz Dynasty ADP tool. It pulls in the RotoViz Triflex FFPC leagues. We're looking at just the classic leagues, not the best ball leagues, from the last month and a half, from the beginning of May through, we're recording today in late June. And so we have about 30 drafts in here, startup drafts that have occurred. And there's a lot of really interesting stuff. As we talk through the quarterbacks, what stands out to me, some of that stuff in the beginning about, Hurts being a little bit lower in Dynasty, you don't get that at the end of the first round where Anthony Richardson is at QB7. He's right up there. He's ahead of Joe Burrow, who is a drop back passer that at one point was viewed sort of like Stroud. After the first couple seasons, he gets his team to a Super Bowl in what was it, in year 2? And it looks like this drop back passer who's going to be such a high level player that he's up there in the top 5. He's now QB8 a couple of years later. And that could be something that happens to Stroud if the next few years go the way that they have for Burrow, which hasn't been quite to the ceiling as I think some of us expected with what the Bengals could have done with Burrow and Chase and Higgins. The passing seasons haven't been so otherworldly. And then you have Herbert at 9, Kyler Murray's 10, Jordan Love's 11, Jaden Daniels is right there at 12 in the middle of the second round in startup ADP. Richardson and Daniels really interesting to me. We've talked about the split between their prices in redraft. Richardson going a lot higher, in part because people seem to think that Daniels is definitely going to get hurt because he took a lot of hits in college, even though he didn't actually get hurt in college. And Richardson did get hurt last year in the pros in multiple games. He only played 4 games. He left 2 of them early. One ultimately ends his season. The other, he took a concussion on a play that he probably didn't need to take that hit. He was scoring on a rushing TD, and he kind of runs into a hit as he's crossing the goal line when he could have been sort of fading away from that hit. In some ways, he could have argued it was a little bit of a cheap shot, what have you. And yet I think he could have done a better job of protecting himself. And yet he goes way ahead of Daniels. Shawn, you've broken down that Daniels' passing profile as a prospect is just worlds better than Richardson's. And we didn't see anything in the first little sample of Richardson at the NFL level, first few games of his career, that changes the passing profile. And so it's fascinating to see, the gap still existing in Dynasty, number one, because Caleb Williams is up there at QB6. He's the guy ahead of Richardson and Burrow in the back half of the first round. Daniels, you'd think in Dynasty would be potentially ahead of Richardson, who was a little bit of an older prospect. There's a bigger gap than 1 year in their age, I'm guessing. Don't have those numbers right in front of me, but we'll get to that in a sec. But that gap is intriguing to me. The fact that Richardson's ahead of Burrow is intriguing to me because Richardson hasn't shown the ability to pass at the NFL level yet. Like we know that I understand it in redraft, where like the 1 year ceiling is so high if he can run at a really high level. But if people are concerned about mobile quarterbacks aging, and then also like if the mobility does like the concern for Richardson would be that the passing's so bad that he's not starting in a couple of years, like Trey Lance, like Justin Fields, like, the perceptions have been with those guys and why they didn't stick as starters. It's not those guys. Lance, we didn't even really see play a lot, but Fields, obviously the rushing production was there. We would have expected it to be there for Lance, but the word is that, in practice and what we did see from Lance, just not a good enough passer to stay on the field. That would be the major concern for Richardson, whose startup ADP is in the first round. It's less of a concern for Daniels, who actually had the really strong passing profile in college, and yet can understand a little bit of skepticism if it's on. This just seems incongruent to me. Like if you're going to be skeptical of Jaden Daniels and have him at QB12 for some of these reasons, okay, fine. He's more of a redraft play than a dynasty play. Then you can't have Richardson at QB7. Like what's happening here?
I think it's exploitable, but I've been making that case for a while. And one of the things I just always want to throw out there with this discussion is that there's probably something I'm not seeing, or, coming to that conclusion early on with these guys, it's hard for me to get back off of it. But the way you described it is, for me, the reason that I have Jaden Daniels in the first round as compared to his QB12 ADP. And I have Richardson in the second round, which for me is actually being very aggressive and saying, I'm going to give a lot of weight to just the couple games that he played last year, because otherwise I think it's even difficult to make an argument for him, in the top, say 12 quarterbacks, because you have a lot of risk of different types. And once you start stacking risk, then you have a lot of different ways to lose. And when you're paying these prices, you need to win. You made a great point, which is that, with Daniels, I do think it's a little bit odd that when we're looking at the prices of guys who were either hurt last year or have been consistently hurt, like Kyler Murray and Lamar Jackson. And one of the things about Lamar Jackson is that he's good at not taking hits, and it has not actually helped him stay healthy, right? He's had several years where, the Ravens lost 2 years of their peak chance to win a Super Bowl because he either couldn't or decided not to play, at the end of those seasons. And so he's been injured. Kyler Murray has been consistently injured. Anthony Richardson, multiple injuries last year. It underlines the risk to these high-scoring quarterbacks, but it also seems to be selectively deployed against a guy who, as you mentioned, has actually stayed healthy.
Yeah, it's really weird. And the great point that I felt like you made there with Richardson is the multiple types of risk. And that's, I can understand bypassing that in redraft to an extent, because you're saying we're purely playing for ceiling in a one season outcome. And if Anthony Richardson is right, the same way that I was gung-ho about Trey Lance a couple years ago, and listeners of Stealing Bananas who are listening then know that I couldn't stop talking about how he projected, and like it looked like a baseline projection would be just so massive for him from a rushing perspective. I contend that if he would have stayed healthy that year, he would have probably still been the starter for the Niners most of that year and probably would have still put up a really strong season. It's the year that he gets hurt early, Garoppolo plays, he gets hurt, and then Purdy ends up becoming the guy late in that year. We never see Lance again. However, the truest same of Richardson, I think. And I think it's true of Daniels too. If these guys stay healthy for the whole year, they're probably going to project really well. But when you start talking about the stacking of risk, that's the thing for me, especially in Dynasty, that with Richardson, I mean, the one risk is injuries, where he seems to not have a great feel as a rusher. We've talked about how he didn't have huge rushing production in college, which goes along with this.
He
Whereas,
wasn't
like,
anywhere close to being the level of rusher of Jaden Daniels. And I would certainly defer to the college football guys on this, but a handful of them who've worked closely with RotoViz, which again, you're going to get some biases when you're talking with your guys, and that's, their perspective. But I mean, Travis May is like, Jaden Daniels is basically a better passing version of Lamar Jackson. Now, quite to the level of his rushing, nobody is that, but Jaden Daniels is unreal. And when you look at the total numbers, you look at the evasion rates, you look at those elements for him, and then he can throw the ball, right? And so you contrast that with one of the knocks on Richardson was, and I think it's interesting because the big difference between Richardson and Fields are the sacks. And Fields is a better, Fields' passing numbers in college were far, far superior, and he's done some things at the NFL level that would suggest that if he was in the right offense, he probably would succeed as a passer. He had a good year for, with and or for DJ Moore last season. But if you have some limits as a passer and you're going to take a bunch of drive-killing plays, I think it's fair to say that's a big issue for him. And that's certainly what the critics will point out, is that will cause a problem. Richardson doesn't have that in his profile, but the thing that the college football analysts would always tell me is that he also doesn't have a good feel for the game. Throws the ball away a bunch when there's nobody there, doesn't run when he has opportunities to do so, can't throw the ball underneath. Now, for me, one of the things that we saw in just that very limited sample last year is that Shane Steichen may make all of that irrelevant.
Right.
He may be that good. And if you're a good fit and the quarterback improves, because one of the things that gets overstated when we take somebody who is not good in college at certain things, and then the NFL guys are like, yeah, well, we'll just fix them. That very rarely happens. There's a huge difference between very rarely and never. And if Richardson is a guy who, as a young player who didn't have a ton of reps in college, does get better, then, then he's this athlete who is incomparable. And you're suddenly looking at a guy who in 2025, maybe he's the overall QB1, right? That would be the flip side of it, is that I talked about the stacking of risk, but it's not impossible that he is the number one guy off the board next year.
And I misspoke when I was saying he's a little bit older. He's actually younger than Jaden Daniels, who played at Arizona State before LSU and was a young prospect, as you noted. For whatever reason, in my head, I was thinking he was an old prospect while I was saying that a second ago. But yeah, I'm with you on the Steichen thing, where, like, if there's something that we're missing here and that we're wrong about, I do think Shane Steichen vis-a-vis Cliff Kingsbury, Dan Quinn, and what they're doing in Washington could be a glaring element of it, because Shane Steichen looked like a really strong coach last year in terms of putting his players in the right positions to succeed, most notably Richardson.
If you're going to give, sorry to interrupt you there, if you're going to give like a scale of 1 to 100, the offensive coaching staffs on Indianapolis, Washington, and Chicago.
Well, Indianapolis is going to be somewhere well above 50. I feel good. I don't know that I feel good enough to say they're like an 80, but they're somewhere in the 60 to 70, maybe 75 range. The others are well below 50. Chicago with Waldron taking over, you don't feel great about that. Eberflus, what they're going to be able to do. And then, Washington, Cliff Kingsbury, not promising stuff.
I thought we might get like an above 90 and a below 10 for the two different groups.
You were expecting a little bit of a wider gap.
So you were very generous or just conservative in both directions, giving these guys a chance to actually show.
Well, 90.
We still have
90s,
a lot to prove on all three of those guys.
90s reserved for McVay and McDaniels and Shanahan and probably and LaFleur's I would put ahead of Steichen. He's probably at the 85 range. I thought he did an incredible job with Love last year. But
Andy Reid wants to be up at 100.
Yeah, Andy Reid's got to be up there. You can't put Steichen up with these guys yet, so
Correct.
he can't be at 90. But he looks very promising through 1 year. He did a lot of really great stuff with Gardner Minshew as well. Thought you saw last year a coach who understood that you you call the game and you game plan for the players you have. You fit scheme to talent. Don't try to fit your talent into your scheme, and you do what the players you have dictate from a coaching perspective, as opposed to the other way around. You get to the Arthur Smith type coaching where it's like, I'm going to make the players do what I think is right. And it's like, you're just not getting the most out of the players on your roster. That's, the ideal from a coach, and setting up players to succeed, to do their absolute best. And I think we saw a lot of that from Steichen, and you have to be really excited about that. But Richardson, the point I was making a moment ago, though, that you made, that I wanted to emphasize, was a stacking risk. You have the risk of injury and maybe the lack of feel for the game and some of that stuff we've talked about, where he could take more hits. And this is so important to emphasize, Sean, because when you talk about it, I've talked about it on some live streams. What's the difference between Richardson and Daniels? Or you made the Richardson and Fields comment. A lot of people in the comments will say, and the pro Richardson crowd will say, Richardson's just a way bigger human. And I really want to emphasize that doesn't matter as much as you guys seem to think it does. So the people that think that just because he's bigger, he can't get hurt. Big guys get injured too. And there is an element to the physiological side of it. I don't even know do we call it physiological at that point? I don't know. I don't know if that's the right word, but some of the smaller guys stay healthy at a crazy rate. You think about like a Wark Dunn or Tiki Barber or whatever. Some guys are just able to take hits and their body holds up, and their tissue and their bones and whatever is like, at least this is my opinion. Like there's a difference between bodies across, whatever. Some just get flukily unlucky, but it seems that everyone is saying the injuries that Richardson took last year don't matter because he's so large, that he's not going to actually take a lot of injuries throughout his career, despite the fact that he did really, in a small sample, take multiple big injuries, unavoidable hits, in my opinion. That's the point that I always try to emphasize. And when we talk about the feel for the game and that stuff, there's big physical guys on defense. And the bigger you are, sometimes the harder they're going to try to hit you. And if you're not good at evading the hits, like that's one of the things about him not having the rushing numbers in college and the Lamar Jackson stuff. You start talking about the evasion rates with Jaden Daniels. Some of these guys have such a feel for it that they're never going to take a full-on heavy shot. Especially like that's the Lamar thing to me, is like Lamar is so agile and such a good runner of the football. That's why I say he could be an NFL running back. He wouldn't take huge hits. He's able to elude them and then, get tackled from a non-squared up hit. He kind of gets spun around and taken down or whatever, relative to, that concussion Richardson took while going into the end zone that I've already talked about was a full-on shoulder-to-shoulder big impact hit that Richardson has to be aware of to not put himself at risk of, in my opinion, running very upright and just very focused on running straight into the end zone. And that's one of those things that, like, when you talk about the numbers, you talk about for running backs, being a workhorse is a skill. Like being able to do that in college and have these huge workloads tends to translate to the NFL because it shows an ability to take the ball every play and not take huge hits every play and stay on the field. And the guys that can't do that, they miss time. Even if they're explosive, there is a feel element to this, to not getting absolutely crushed sometimes. That's not something that Richardson has shown. And I'm more concerned about Richardson's health than I am about Daniels. And I know that there are the highlight clips of Daniels taking some big hits too. And so I thought that was interesting that you mentioned his evasion rate. I haven't looked at those numbers. It's good to hear that he actually does evade some tackles too, because it could just be the fact that there's 3 or 4 highlights where he got crunched and there's a bunch of others.
Well, and the flip side of it, I think, is that someone like Bo Nix, who's very athletic, very mobile, has low evasion rates, in part because when the defender is there, he goes down.
Yeah.
And so you don't take the hit. Right. And so I think we want to be aware of some of the potential problems for Jaden Daniels. Anthony Richardson had very, very high evasion rates too, because he's so freakishly athletic. The question was, it didn't necessarily translate into the big raw rushing numbers, in part because, he's throwing the ball away when you don't need to. Now, if they can get him to not do that and run, which is something I think already showed up last year, then again, you're talking about a fantasy
maybe he
force.
could be fantastic. But then, so I'm overemphasizing the injury risk for sure. But I'm trying to drive that point home because the pushback I've consistently gotten is his size, and that he's not as big of a risk because he's bigger than a Daniels or a Fields or quarterbacks like that. a Kyler Murray. And I do think that's a little bit of an oversimplification. Probably he can take more hits because he is bigger and stronger, but not to the degree that I think people are just writing it off in their mind. And then the second risk, when you're talking about the stacking the risk, is the passing stuff. If he's not good enough as a passer, if the Trey Lance, type risk of, well, yeah, he's a great athlete and he can run and all these things, but he just can't hit somebody running on a wide open crosser, and that's a problem. And we can't keep playing him. And they did go out and pay a good amount of money to Joe Flacco after they had to let Gardner Minshew go for even more money because Minshew played really well last year. They still made backup QB a priority. And I'm sure the Browns wanted to bring Flacco back because they went and got Jameis. They still thought backup QB was a priority, but they weren't able to match what the Colts wanted to play Flacco. There's two teams there that told you with their offseason moves that they weren't super confident in their starter starting 17 games. They wanted to make backup QB a priority. And the Colts actually outbid the Browns, who probably had the inside track with Flacco, taking them to the playoffs last year. Anyway, we don't need to make this whole show about Richardson and Daniels, but it is fascinating. And I think that was a great point about stacking the risk, and a particularly strong point for Dynasty, because there's multiple ways that Richardson could lose a lot of value in Dynasty, right? It could be either or. The Steichen thing,
and when you have
is
less track record too, any type of down performance is going to push you further down than someone who has established themselves. And in that context, it's a little bit interesting. Are you surprised that, I think you can ask this either way. Are you surprised that Justin Herbert is as far down as QB9? He's someone that Pat and I, in a startup 2 years ago, selected a QB3, and fortunately, we were able to trade him in a package for Josh Allen last year, which led us to a title, because if we had Herbert, we would not have won. Or are you surprised that he's that low? I think you could ask about Herbert. Like, is that high, that low? I could see him down where Trevor Lawrence is. Are you surprised that Trevor Lawrence has retained QB 13 status when he has now, I don't want to say that he's tarnished this generational prospect tag, but he's kind of established himself in that good, not great range. It makes sense that he would be above players like Purdy, who probably isn't going to get the EP numbers, is going to have crazy efficiency just to maintain his status. Players like Tua and Goff, it's just shocking how much of a zero they are in the running game. Someone like a Trevor Lawrence, who doesn't stand out to you at all. Two guys like Jordan Love and Trevor Lawrence, who don't stand out as running quarterbacks, they actually have to still do significantly less than Tua and Goff, simply because they do move around a little bit, and that inadvertently almost will add to their running score.
200-300 rushing yards. Yeah. It goes a long way. 200-300 rushing yards goes a long way. And Herbert is like that too. I think the question on Herbert QB9 is, I think it's a very fair price, and I think it's a good question in the sense that we were talking about Dynasty being year to year, and his redraft ADP is even lower. There's a lot of concern about this being a very run offense, but at the same time, I think he's a high floor play in Dynasty because of a lot of the things we've just been talking about with some of the young mobile quarterbacks aren't concerns. Like, we feel like Justin Herbert is definitely a long-term NFL starter, is definitely a good quarterback, is definitely going to retain value. Even if he doesn't have monster passing numbers, he's not going to crater and go to zero. Like Trey Lance was going in the second round in startups a couple of years ago and is now has no value, right? Like Justin Herbert can't. That could happen with Richardson. It's not going to happen with Herbert. It's a totally different sort of classification of asset, if you will. If we're going to simplify, obviously these are humans, and some people hate when we use the finance terms, but if we're going to simplify it into like risk and upside and all of that stuff, Herbert to me is a totally different type of player, where the skepticism about his short-term scoring and his redraft ADP, that's what's reflected in him being so low at QB9. But the fact that he's higher than his redraft ADP emphasizes the high floor and the lack of risk around him as a play. And I think that all actually fits together with the other market over on the redraft side, and it makes sense to have him in this range. Maybe he should go a little bit higher.
He was actually pretty bad the last couple of years under two different coordinators, and with decent targets at times. I don't know. How many more average seasons would we need for his
Right.
2 years to start because he was fantastic. He's only 26. His rookie year and his second year were sensational. That's why we drafted him after that second year as the third overall player off the board. But he's been pretty mediocre. And after 2022, the explanation was the offensive coordinator. After 2023, I think the explanation can also still be mostly the offensive coordinator. But this to me seems like a very important season for him, even though
Sure.
it's a rebuilding type of season for them. And, now people are stretching to, want to make McConkey a star for him. The other guys are probably not true starters, although there's been interesting rhetoric around Quentin Johnson coming out of there and their whole point that this dude is a manufactured touch guy. Why do they draft him in the first round and not throw the ball to him at the line of scrimmage? Are you concerned that Harbaugh massively raises the floor because the Chargers are now going to be competent for a decade, barring some? I mean, we have that confidence, but I mean, he's not still with the San Francisco 49ers. He's not still with the Michigan Wolverines. But is there a concern that the long-term ceiling now is pretty much capped, or could they build into a pretty dynamic offense? I mean, passing offense.
I think they could build into a decent passing offense. I'm not really buying that they'll be super run heavy forever. One of the things with Harbaugh's past, at the college level in the Big Ten, I get it. When you look at his time in San Francisco, obviously you have Kaepernick. Even prior to that, you have Alex Smith, who's a little bit mobile, and it was a different NFL. And I mean, I guess I'm just not buying that Harbaugh's definitely going to be so extremely run heavy in this offense and in this situation, even this year, but probably to a degree this year. You went and hired Greg Roman and everything. I hear your point about Herbert hasn't been perfect and there's some risk. I think the contract is a huge element, is what I would say, and is where I was going to go with Lawrence too. You talked about the good, not great tier that he's in. I think when you get the extension with that kind of guaranteed money over those kinds of years for both of these guys, that's a big part of the floor and the stability where they're going to get opportunities. Even if they struggle for the next couple of years, they're going to be the guy in their for their offenses and in those passing games. I just think Herbert's a really narrow band player. I don't know that the value can rise, but I also don't think it's going to crater because I think people are going to justify a lack of production on the offense, right? I'm trying to think of a good comp. Is there a good comp of a player who played in a pretty run heavy offense, but was still a pretty efficient and good quarterback? I can't really think of a good comp for that, but
I mean, some listeners might be saying, the 49ers, the Lions, the Dolphins were the most dynamic rushing offenses in 2023. And because they were dynamic and they weren't smash mouth, that their quarterbacks were all able to land kind of also in that sort of narrow band that you talked about. But the overall team efficiency allowed them to be good, not great.
yeah, I think
But there
that's
seemed like there are probably some apples and oranges elements to that with a Justin Herbert.
right. I think Herbert could still have some seasons that spike the pass volume. I guess the comp I
Are
would
you
make
concerned that it's like a Ryan Tannehill?
no,
But someone who doesn't have this very small peak and then go away again. But like what Ryan Tannehill was for a couple of seasons where he was good.
I think the comp that comes to my mind is the earlier career Ben Roethlisberger. Roethlisberger late career had a bunch of high pass volume seasons. They led the NFL in passing I just pulled it up in 2018 in pass attempts. But he never had a 600 pass attempt season until his age 32 year in 2014. I'm kind of thinking earlier in his late 20s. They had some good defenses. They ran the ball well. When they had Willie Parker, Rashad Mendenhall, those guys, late stage Jerome Bettis. Early career Ben Roethlisberger was thought of as a clear above average quarterback, potentially a top 5 quarterback or at least top 10 quarterback. He had already won a Super Bowl really early in his career, and then won another one right in the middle of his career somewhere. Didn't add a ton of rushing, maybe not the exact same apples to apples thing as Herbert either, because Herbert can probably add a couple hundred rushing yards in a way that Roethlisberger couldn't, and didn't have a ton of pass volume. And yet you were like, well, he can still have some spike seasons. He can have some spike touchdown rate seasons. He can have, Matt Ryan kind of came to mind there, but they like early career Matt Ryan, like they ran, I think, a decent amount with Michael Turner and stuff. And then he eventually later in his career has an MVP season where he spikes a touchdown rate. I mean, I feel like that's sort of where we're headed, that type of a player where the longevity as a starter is clear and is there. And that matters to fantasy drafters and to the value of him in Dynasty. Maybe there's some seasons where the pass rate is just too low and it's frustrating, but also I think there will be some seasons where it peaks in a way that people aren't really anticipating, maybe even this year, because they might not actually win as much as people are like expecting that Harbaugh is going to immediately turn things around. They might have to throw because of game script a little more than people expect. Now, that might only mean like league average passing, because a lot of people think they're going to be bottom 5 in passing. Anyway, he's an interesting one to talk through as well, but I don't see the Ryan Tannehill type stuff. I don't think that's the path that Justin Herbert's career is going on based on the way that all the kind of film people talk about him, people who analyze the QB position all seem to really love Herbert from like every element, like the mechanics, the ball placement, everything. Like it kind of checks across the board. His numbers haven't been perfect, but a lot of that does get put on the offensive coordinators when people go and dig into it and analyze it. It seems to me that there's a pretty strong consensus, including in the Chargers organization, where they extended him and gave him a ton of guaranteed money, that he's going to be a decade plus starter from here on for at least the next decade. And I think that's the expectation for Trevor Lawrence as well. And so the value for those guys makes sense to me in a way that's like, I mean, Lawrence, I think, still has some ceiling. He could just be a little bit of a later bloomer, and their pass volume could be high. Frankly, it wouldn't surprise me if it was very high. Maybe a little bit more risk, but yeah, I mean, probably I would say his QB 13 price seems a little bit exploitable relative to Herbert being QB 9, because I think they both have high floors, and maybe Lawrence to me has a little bit of a higher short-term ceiling in a way that his value could actually rise again. Anyway, those guys are interesting. I don't know. Does that check out for you? Like you kind of ask those questions. That's sort of my 2 cents on it. I'm curious your thoughts. Does that?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that they are appropriately priced. I would prefer non-quarterbacks to
In that
them
range. Yeah.
in that range. And so
That makes
that's
sense.
the way that I'm attacking it. I like Jordan Love over Kyler Murray and Justin Herbert. Those guys are going 9, 10, 11, 3 consecutive picks early there in round 2. Then we need to get into some other positions, but kind of as a transition, I did want to ask you about Bryce Young, who is at QB 20. QB 20 doesn't sound very optimistic when you think about a guy who just last year was the number 1 overall pick and was taken ahead of CJ Stroud. It is interesting, though, in that QB 20 still puts him in the middle of round 6. It puts him ahead of guys like Deebo Samuel, Rashee Rice, Jaden Reed. That emphasizes, I think, what you do have to pay for QBs. One of the reasons I bring him up, obviously there's been, positive reports on him. We like the fact that they added weapons around him. It's also like vaguely interesting, even thinking about our team, which we occasionally will profile on the show. We had the 105 this past rookie draft season and took Brock Bowers. That was perfect for us because tight end was, well, we've got some other interesting names like a Luke Musgrave and a Pat Freiermuth. Those guys, and in some ways are actually a little bit trendy, but we wanted to have a huge punch at that position. He does, I hope. If he doesn't give us the huge punch, then that will be pretty demoralizing. But the other position then, as we kind of work through this and we are pointing our team at a 2024 title, my evaluation of it would be deep and talented, loaded. But the QBs are Tua and Derek Carr. And so, I mean, that would be the remaining area to still potentially address. We have a lot of players. We're going to need to get down a little bit. George Pickens is the wide receiver 23 there in the middle of round 5. He is on our roster. We do have plenty of receiver depth. You don't necessarily need to think of it directly in those guys, but how are you looking at Bryce Young? Would he be a trade target for you? The other reason I kind of bring it up is in our league, the Bryce Young manager probably could move him. And so that part is interesting as well. But Bryce Young there at QB 20 in best ball, he's about QB 25. And I don't know that we are necessarily getting information from one format that washes into the other in a way that is super exploitable there. If Young has a decent season in his second year and reestablishes himself, that doesn't necessarily mean that his dynasty value is going to dramatically spike. And it doesn't necessarily mean that he would have really even done that much for you at QB 25. I mean, he could be someone who hits in reality and doesn't help you in best ball. So I don't know that there's something to take away there. I think it's more, where are we QB 20 with Bryce Young?
Well, my immediate thought is it's like when we talk about, drafting quarterbacks for the way that they hold value in dynasty, and why it's worth taking them in the first round, even if they're not the sexiest pick or the most fun pick at times in rookie drafts. This I feel like this is sort of an example where he had about as catastrophic of a rookie year as you can have, and he's still going in the middle of the 6th round ahead of guys like Deebo Samuel and Rashee Rice. And if you can trade him in, like if I would have drafted Bryce Young, I've realized some lost value because he was terrible last year. But I would probably be willing to trade him at this point at that price, because you're talking about being able to get some pretty intriguing assets back potentially in a 1-for-1 as far as where he's going in startup value. And the reality is if he has a bad second season, then it's just gone. The value is just gone. And an example of this is, and this is a lesson that's been preached a lot in terms of getting out of these falling value situations a year early. It's been preached long enough that I heard the arguments about, our buddy Pat Kerrane was a big one who argued this and convinced me about taking the quarterbacks in the first round of rookie drafts long enough ago that I took Zach Wilson at like a 108 in one of my drafts, and I didn't want to draft Zach Wilson. I thought he was a bad pick, and whatever receiver I wanted there would have been more fun. But I understood that he probably holds value, and he has a terrible rookie season, and then I trade him the next year for 2 seconds, and like, it's pretty good value holding, right? Like I still get the 2 seconds in the during the draft. And I think I got to move up in the first round, like a 1-pick move up and 2 seconds. And I traded Zach Wilson to do that. And that move up helped me get a player, a tier higher than I maybe would have gotten if I just let that person pick. And I got 2 additional second-round picks. And it's like, he was a first-round pick last year, but he had a horrible rookie year. His value has since gone to 0. The point is I'm not saying Bryce Young's definitely going to be Zach Wilson, but you can get, after one bad season, you can get out of this type of a player, or a player like Zach Wilson, who eventually did go to 0. You can get out of them and still get some value out of it. And so that's one of the big arguments to consider taking quarterbacks so high, is the way that they retain value and all that stuff. Now, the question that you're posing is, should we be trying to buy into him because maybe he is just an opportunity at this stage?
And I'll kind of flip it around and say, your point is a very good one. The flip side of that is that Bryce Young was a dramatically better prospect. And that does matter, even though his rookie season was as bad as Zach Wilson, which is hard to believe. Now drafters know that if they took that and they lost all the value, that there is a real reason to get back out and not let it fall to 0, which with someone who is the type of prospect that Young was, might give us an opening to acquire him if that's a need and we have the ammunition.
Yeah, no, and I think that makes sense. I think that's interesting. One of the fascinating things about him going QB 20 in round 6, the other thing I would mention is JJ McCarthy. We might need a detour to talk about this a little bit, is a QB 19. He's going 1 spot behind Drake May in the middle of the 4th at 409. He's going 1 spot ahead of Nico Collins. He's going ahead of Devon Achane and Travis Etienne. just behind Kyle Pitts in a tight end premium situation. JJ McCarthy, not the type of quarterback prospect that I love that price on. And then there's a 2-round break in ADP here where it's like, okay, McCarthy and May are the end of a tier. The veterans right before them are Goff and Tua at QB 16, QB 17. And then the round prior is Dak and Purdy. And so that's like the first group of quarterbacks is ending. The first wave of quarterbacks is ending in late round 4. There's no quarterback going in all of round 5 by ADP, and Bryce Young comes out in the middle of round 6 at 607. And then Kirk Cousins, Deshaun Watson, and Bo Nix comes in behind that. And how is Bo Nix going 3 rounds behind JJ McCarthy? I mean, anyway, Bo Nix is an opportunity at that price.
People haven't read my article, and the people who did read it, and I have gotten some messages even from some very friendly readers who are like, we love your stuff. We do not believe your Bo Nix article at all.
Okay. But I will be shocked if Bo Nix doesn't have at least a floor of production in a system that he is such a perfect fit for. But that's not the point of your question. I guess the Bryce Young thing is interesting. There is, I think, an opportunity to buy him if you believe in him long term. I'm not sure that I necessarily do. I do think Deontay Johnson was the perfect acquisition that, in terms of reasonable acquisitions. They weren't going to go out and get Justin Jefferson or anything. And I think adding Xavier Legette and continue to try to add, some playmaking in addition to Deontay Johnson is good. Hopefully Legette, if they can get anything out of Mingo, those guys can be good second. Jatavian Sanders can be good secondary options, and Deontay can be the big, volume earning number 1. And maybe Adam Thielen is still helping in that regard too. But you get a better overall passing, receiving core than what Young has had to deal with. But I don't know, man. It doesn't feel like a good enough situation improvement, even with Deontay Johnson, that he can have a big enough season that the consensus opinion on him is going to turn from bust to something different after year 2. I think it would take a lot for that to change. I'm willing to take him in some redraft and bet on a lot of those trends in redraft. But I think the value has already been hurt, and the perception of him has already been hurt to such a degree. The comparisons to Stroud, all of that stuff, it's almost like, Bryce Young's name is now tainted in some way in dynasty managers' minds, where even if he has a bounce back year next year and he gets back onto a positive progression, I don't think his value is going to shoot up. And so I actually think that you could argue, if you want to be looking for an opportunity to buy back into Bryce Young, maybe you look to do that in season if you start to see some of those positive trends, or you look to do it next off season, because even after a good bounce back sophomore season, he's still very gettable, is sort of the way that I don't know that now is when I would want to be buying in.
And you mentioned still very gettable, and part of that is just, again, that rushing element of it. One of the reasons that I really approach the QBs from the other perspective is that, you need stars. You need a player the level of a Caleb Williams who is worth the 101. You need a player like a Jaden Daniels who brings the right scoring profile and who I believe was worth the 102, even though in this particular draft he falls below Marvin Harrison, who has a startup ADP of 112. That I still think is kind of insane, even with how good he is. The passing QB, if you win, you got to win at the CJ Stroud level, which is an amazingly high level to win at. Lawrence is interesting because he's held that value in part simply because he was considered to be a generational prospect and hasn't been a bust, but yet he has not paid off for people.